you are. For the record, thank you, Professor Wilson. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me here. Welcome to all of you here and online. As a matter of fact, yes, what I do for a living, that's also what I always say, is that I teach German linguistics and German proficiency. But my research interest, among other things, is in multimodal interaction analysis. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I will start off with a prologue. It's all about politics these days in Europe, in Belgium, in Flanders. So this is a famous politician in Belgium. He's the leader of the most successful party in the Flemish part, the Dutch-speaking part of the country. But this picture is taken from a debate on national Flemish television about 6 years ago, when there was another political crisis. He was as a guest invited to the television studios, and of course we're not going to focus on the political content, but on the gestures, right? So at a certain moment, he's also the mayor from the city of Antwerp, so he's an influential person, and at a certain point during the discussion, he said, well, I now really have to say from Antwerp, it's this or it's this. I'm showing you these two screenshots to sort of address a common thought, maybe, that we all think like the meaning is in the words, right? Is in the sentences, the expressions we use, and okay, there may be some gesturing and other stuff going on. But if you look at what he's saying, so the wordings, it isn't that much. He only says, I really have to say from Antwerp, it's this or it's this. If you do not have visual access to the signs, the thumbs up or thumbs down, you do not really know what he's saying. So this is one example to show you that we really need this multimodal approach. I'm going to say a few words later on this concept of multimodality. If we want to have an accurate analysis of meaning, both in production and in interpretation. Okay. Prologue part 2. Think yourselves of giving a talk or speaking to an audience, and again, starting with this idea, the meaning is in the words, right? Even, well, especially in simple words. Yes always means yes, something positive. People might think so. But imagine that you're talking to an audience, and that as a back channel behavior by that audience, you only get the signal, the back channel, the signals, the lexical elements, yes. So if I would be talking to you and you would only go like yes, 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 I would feel very uncomfortable, because what I would like to see also is that you would use the same particles, yes, but also do the nodding. If you go like yes, yes, then I get a positive back channel signal. And just to show you, it's in a very simple word where you almost get opposite meanings, but you have to take into account, the gesture, in this case, the nodding. Okay. Final situation, just to show you that the meaning is not just about analyzing the wordings. If I would say, that's very interesting what you're telling me there, or that's very interesting what you're telling me there, then I'm using exactly the same words, but I'm using an index finger, and I'm individualizing you. I'm sorry for or same wordings, and I use my hand palm up, and I'm raising my eyebrows that I do not have, and then I'm inviting you in a more friendly manner. Okay, so gesturing really actively contributes to processes of meaning making. Okay, both on the production side or on the interpretation side. So meaning is multimodal, and by multimodal we mean that the meaning, the elements of meaning, the interpretation does not just reside in the verbal elements, be they words or parts of words or sentences or texts or books. No, other resources like imagery, cognitive structure, prosody, gesture, posture, gaze, depiction, materiality, space and structure, space and architecture, they all play or can play a significant role in the process of meaning making. And today I would like to focus on gesturing, not so much on posture, but the focus will be on gestures. this is still part of my introduction, right? Because there are many co-speech gestures. I won't be talking about sign language, by the way. It's about co-speech gestures. So in literature, there are many suggestions to distinguish types of gesturing. I'm just going to scan through a few and already give you some examples. By the way, the examples I will be showing you are taken from the Flemish Parliament. I will come back to that later on, but just to give you an idea what types of gestures we can distinguish. Here's the first type, we call them metaphorical gestures, where we represent one domain of knowledge in terms of another domain of knowledge. Like we speak about quantity, more or less of something, constantly in terms of verticality. And we also do so by using metaphorical gestures. For instance, when this politician is talking about low interest rates causing prices to soar or to rise. Okay? So we talk about verticality, but we take refuge, or we use concepts, spatial concepts, verticality. We do not realize this, but this is a metaphorical mapping. All right, just have a look at this brief sentence.
Rentes en de prijzen van het vastgoed
I'm going to say
gestegen. Door de lage rentes en de prijzen van het vastgoed fors gestegen en
it's doubled, right? So he uses the metaphor. This is what I've marked in red, the low interest rates and prices rise. So you could say, okay, you could do without the gesturing. Fair enough. I can fill another talk or two maybe on metaphorical gestures. I won't dwell on this too long. This is another example from the same Flemish Parliament. This politician is favoring a unified community council, and she's complaining we still have one community council and a second council, which is the social council. And what she's doing, and this is the visual part, she is advocating.
There's a strange
echo.
Yeah, but this is high pitched noise.
Yeah, but it's outside the room.
It's
outside the room.
It's outside the room. No, it's not us. No.
Sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. So she's advocating, she's a minister advocating an integrated community council, and she's locating this integrated council in front of her torso, instead of the two separate councils existing at the time, one council and another type of council. So what she's doing is objectifying the council by giving these concepts a situation, a spatial location. Right? So let's have a look at
lokaal sociaal beleid dat geïntegreerd is. En dat bestaat vandaag niet, meneer De Loor. Er is nog altijd de gemeenteraad, men heeft nog altijd de Oosten- en Weerraad.
There's a delay, I think we still have this one and another one. I want an integrated one. If you are talking about complex things, it helps if you can manage. We are going to discuss this difficult problem today. Here it is. I put it in the middle of the table. There it is. So a spatialization or an objectification is some type of metaphor which is being frequently used. Another type of metaphor is representation of time in terms of horizontality. And since in the West we write from left to right, future is being situated to the right and past to the left. This is what we did yesterday. We will be talking about this today. And tomorrow we will be focusing on this. Right? Have a look at this politician. He talks about the septenate, the budget for 7 years, European concept, which is about to end. By the way, his dominant hand is this left hand. So one might think, okay, so then he orients this future to the left, which is not the case, as you will see.
Eind december 2020 eindigt het septenaat, de 7-jarige begroting die Europa.
Yeah, so he marks the beginning of the septenate, And then he progressively, by 3 steps, not by 7, it's not an iconic representation, he moves his left hand further to the right, okay, to mark, well, the beginning of the septonate, then further to the right. So this is another example of a metaphorical gesture representing time. And the last example of metaphorical gestures is what I call, well, not just it's waking up sleeping metaphors. Because one question in linguistics is, to what extent do we still activate the literal meaning when we use a metaphor, both in verbal terms, but also in gestural terms? And this is a very nice example because, well, the topic she is addressing here is trading agreements between Europe and other partners. And at a certain point, she says, well, one has to be careful because it quite often is the case that one of the partners in such agreement is far too dominant and might suffocate the other economic partner. Just have a look.
Het verleden van die vrijhandelsakkoorden, waarbij één overheersende partner de andere eigenlijk verstikt.
To suffocate. So what happens here, and it's from a cognitive perspective very interesting, you activate both meanings. The literal meaning is being depicted by what she is doing gesturally, but of course she is talking about economic suffocation, right? As I said, from a cognitive point of view, it's quite interesting and a rather complicated thing that apparently, and we do not have any problems whatsoever in processing both a metaphorical meaning and a literal meaning at the same time, but both modes of communication are integrated. Okay, this leads me too far. I'm quite excited always about metaphorical gesture, but okay. Another type of gestures are co-speak gestures, are pragmatic gestures. They do not represent new content, let's say, but some, for instance, a stance or how people look at a certain content. Like in this case, this politician says that establishing these international trade agreements, they are incredibly important. And he's not just stating it verbally, but you have to look at how he's slightly shaking his head. It's not the negation, the head shake, the firm negation where you firmly shake your head. No, that's not the case. That's not the negation which is at hand. It's the loose, pragmatic head shake. He pulls his eyebrows up and he frowns his forehead. At a certain point, he says, it's an incredibly important something. So the intensification.
Ongeveer 2/3 gestoeld en gesteund door wat wij kunnen waarmaken door onze battles out. Het is een ongelooflijke belangrijk iets. Ongeveer 2/3 gestoeld en gesteund door wat wij kunnen waarmaken door onze battles out. Het is een ongelooflijke belangrijk iets.
You clearly see his head. It's a pragmatic gesture to express some sort of self-evidence. It's incredibly important something. Okay. So you can distinguish, let's say, 6 types. Other scholars distinguish more types or less types. It's not about that today, but you can identify symbolic gestures, as we saw with the thumbs up or the thumbs down, iconic gestures, which depict literally a process. If I'm telling a bedtime story and I go like, and then in pitch dark, he entered the room, then you can see what kind of doorknob I'm holding, because I could also say, and then he entered the room, and it's a different doorknob, right? So those are iconic gestures, when you are literally sort of depicting the action at hand. Then we talk about metaphorical gestures, pointing gestures, that will be the topic today, beat gestures, as well, if we want to intensify or visualize the intensification. This is really important that we, and so forth, where you have a nice synchronization between verbal accent or prosody and visual prosody. And then pragmatic gestures as the last example I just showed you. Okay, but we will be focusing on pointing gestures today. And a few weeks back, you had the ultimate specialist on pointing gestures and gestures in general, Soparo Kita from Warwick University here, who has published a very nice book on pointing gestures, just to make clear that I'm not, well, the ultimate scholar on pointing gestures. A lot of things have been said about it, like variations and multimodal co-occurrences, or how these gestures can be maybe adapted to socio-material circumstances or interactional recipients, how they can organize local reference, how types to address or point to an addressee, as this nice example is showing you, and I will be talking about this example later on. This is a politician, a minister. At the end of a Q&A, he's using several pointing gestures, and I'm going to just single out a few. And it's at the end of a Q&A. So in the previous hour, a lot of questions were asked to him by individual colleagues of his, and there had also been an incident at which point he had to address the president, who is at his right, the president of Parliament. And in this address now, he's using an index finger to point at one of his colleagues who asked him a specific question. And while talking, he also turns his torso towards the president, saying a few words, but all can be categorized as pointing gestures.
Een aantal parameters. En ik zal straks, als alle sprekers aan beurt zijn geweest, een globaal overzicht, want hier is veel gezegd. Hier zijn veel vragen gesteld. Ik heb ook begrepen dat ik een pak huiswerk meekrijg.
Okay, what we see are actually 3 types of pointing gestures, just to make sure, to make you clear how many formal variation there is. So he, at a certain point, he says, I will ride away when all speakers have spoken. And then he is pointing at one of his colleagues who asked him an nasty question. And then he turns his torso to the right, which Shakeloff calls a body talk, right? Indicating at the president, I will address all these questions at the end of the Q&A. And this refers to the little incident he had previously with the president. But mind you that he is just continuing his utterance, his proposition, and that he's not interrupting his verbal production just to insert the gestures, right? So this is what one might call multi-activity. You are making verbal utterances, and at the same time you are performing some interaction management, if you like, by using different kinds of, in this case, pointing gestures. And then at the end, he has this threefold self-pointing where he says, because much has been said here, a lot of questions have been asked, and I understand I get a lot of homework with me. So this is the closure of his utterance here, where he sort of realizes that he has had quite a lot of questions, and he repeats this double pointing gestures 3 times. So it's the singling out pointing gesture. It's the torso being used as an articulator, which operates as a pointing gesture, and then both of his hands used for self-pointing. Okay, I think that should be enough to count as some sort of introduction into co-speech, gesturing, and pointing gestures. 2 words on my background. My background is in cognitive linguistics, cognitive grammar, but that's not that important, and it's not the single paradigm from where people are, or linguists are, looking at the role of co-speech gestures. So I'm sort of at a crossroads between multimodal interaction analysis or interactional linguistics, cognitive grammar. The main thing is that what these paradigms have in common is that they focus not just on the linguistic system per se, like you have in morphology and historical linguistics or syntax or phonology, but that you're focusing on the so-called usage event, which is the situated language use, where you take all these dimensions into account, like gesturing. Okay, so the primary focus is on the organization of the action or the interaction, taking into account multiple resources and moving away sort of from a logocentric view on interaction, a view on interaction in which you would only like to focus on the wordings, on the sentences, on the text. Because then you fall short. I have to say it's this or this. If I do not take into account the gesturing, that sentence is opaque. Okay. All right. My aim is to show you that pointing gestures really operate as a crucial semiotic resource in process of meaning making, and both in the production and interpretation process. And they, as such, they tie in with local and verbal factors of the usage event. If this person is sitting in the Flemish Parliament, which is a large hall, he needs huge or big gestures with big amplitude. If you're sitting in a television studio, which is a much more intimate room, you can suffice with small gestures in front of your torso. So the material situation really does play an active role in how gestures are being produced and being interpreted. Okay, so I'm really advocating a multimodal interaction analysis, saying that we need a combined socio-cognitive conversation analytical perspective, where we analyze both verbal and situational resources. And on a more technical note, in terms of construction grammar, linguists should take into account gestures if they try to analyze and identify separate linguistic constructions, let's say multimodal constructions, but I'm going to leave that out of our discussion and our talk today. So my data set is our two plenary debates in Flemish Parliament in 2017, which I've transcribed according to standard norms like the GATT2 transcription system or Mondada when referring to transcribing gesture in line with speech production. This is a view of the plenary hall in the Flemish Parliament. It used to be an inner courtyard, and they've covered it with a nice roof. And okay, so the ministers I will be focusing on are sitting up front to the right, as you can see. So it's a pretty big room, right? Just to give you that idea. What I'm going to do in this talk is to focus on four phenomena, let's say linguistic phenomena, parentheses, metonymy, the realization of argument structure, and then one specific construction, which is the transitive construction. And just to make you sure that if we want to have an accurate account of what these phenomena are all about, we have to take into account pointing gestures, right? Which is quite at a big distance from the idea that we can suffice describing these phenomena by looking at the verbal elements per se. Okay. First phenomenon, parenthesis, and you're all familiar with that. It's been described extensively, and it's the phenomenon where you sort of add some secondary information to your primary communicative message, and you mark it syntactically and prosodically. For instance, today I want to talk about a very important thing, at least that's what I'm trying to do here. Namely, you see where the parenthesis is. I have a short pause, I lower my volume, I lower my pitch, I use some gestures, okay? So this is a parenthesis in a typical realization. So syntactically not integrated, prosodically marked, for instance, by a pause or volume drop or low or realizing a lower pitch, and most parentheses operate as a meta comment on the primary message. The example I would like you to show you is the following, where this politician, after realizing the conjunct, because the Dutch equivalent, he uses the pointing gestures to point at a previous speaker, and then he continues his utterance. So let's have a look. So he says, because state investments have also a positive effect. There we go.
Want overheidsinvesteringen hebben ook een positief effect.
I'm going to play one more time.
Want overheidsinvesteringen hebben ook een positief effect.
It's not really fluently, but what he's doing is because, and normally after because you would expect the subordinate clause to follow right away. He then inserts the parenthesis, and it's not a verbal parenthesis, it's just a pointing gesture. He points at the previous speaker. So what happens here is, okay, so the preceding and the following frame are verbal. He says, because state investments have also a positive effect. Those are verbal elements. He interrupts it by using the pointing gestures. which could be paraphrased as said before by colleague X. Okay. So what we see here, that it is a clear example of a parenthesis where you have a syntactic non-integrated structure, prosodically marked by the pause, which can be labeled, of course, as a filled pause, because it's the gesture which is filling the pause. And it's a functional meta comment, right? So the gesture points at the previous speaker, which sort of indirectly says, like, I'm referring to the lateral, to the utterance made by the previous speaker. So it's actually a double indirect reference. He doesn't just refer to the previous speaker, of course, to what the previous speaker just said, right? So what we have to observe here is that it's very much a spatial action which is unfolding. There is gesturing, there is gaze, there is prosody, syntax, and pragmatics being integrated. And that would be a good candidate, let's say, for a multimodal construction, which could be labeled a multimodal parenthesis. Okay. If you just stick to analyzing political discussion or language by looking at, in terms of big data, by looking at the protocols which are available, freely available, right? You're missing this information. You're missing that he's referring to the previous speaker. You're missing the entire interaction management part. And as such, you're missing that multimodal construction. Because these elements, these visual elements are not being described in terms of protocol. Okay, metonymy. We all know about metaphor, where we sort of map if conceptualization or structure or knowledge from one familiar domain onto another domain on the basis of similarity. Metonymy traditionally also maps elements from one concept onto another, but not on the basis of similarity, but on the basis of contiguity. And we're all familiar with metonymic relationships like part whole, or whole standing for part, or a place standing for a person, or a cause for an effect, like in those 5 sails on the horizon are approaching fast. Of course, we know that there is a ship attached to it, to the sails, but it's the sails we perceive, we see, and it's much more convenient to label what we see and then to think and to do the closure by adding conceptually the ship to it. That's a typical example of metonymy. It's a mechanism of efficiency to get organized in terms of efficiency. Number 12 would like to pay waiters among each other in a restaurant, and not the man in the pink suit who has ordered. That's too much information. Number 12 would like to pay. The ham sandwich would like to pay. London says it's not going to. The government in London, okay, this is metonymy. All right. Ron Lineker labels this type of reasoning, reference point reasoning. What we are doing is we are labeling prominent elements which we can see, to which we have sensory access, which are easy to talk about, in order to refer to a target which is much more complex to describe, much more abstract quite often. So it's an example of efficient language use. And a traditional cognitive account, of which I'm a part, because in my first PhD post, in my PhD was about metonymy, really. So I'm among them here, saying that, well, what we see here are interactive discourse images leading the interpreting mind to an intended target meaning, the 5 sails, and you know what is meant. Are you in the phone book? Yes. It's not me, but my name. Okay, stuff like that. It's all over the place. So it is a projection from a source to a target. Now let's have a look at an example, because the point that I'm getting here is that we have a misconception about metonymy always having to lead the interpreting mind from the source to the target. There's something strange going on with pointing gestures here. And let's have a look at this example first. A politician, it's not him, but it's a female colleague of his, saying it's again about trade treaties. And she says, trade treaties are not little jokes. They are not jokes, neither for Europe, neither for the counterparts. And when she says they're not jokes, neither for Europe, then she has 2 instances of self-pointing. So let's have a look.
Die handelsakkoorden, dat zijn geen lachertjes. Dat zijn geen lachertjes nog voor Europa, nog
Yeah, one more time.
voor de counterpartners, voor onze tegen of met andere.
Yeah, sorry.
Die handelsakkoorden, dat zijn geen lachertjes. Dat zijn geen lachertjes, nog voor Europa, nog voor de counterpartners, voor onze tegenpartijen. Is dat nu Mexico heeft het voorbeeld gegeven.
Thank you. I hope you could see the self-pointing. Okay. So what's going on? She is talking about Europe, and at that point she's pointing at herself. So verbally, she is talking about the topic, about the target of this debate, which is Europe as one of the partners of these trade treaties. But at the same time, she points at herself as one of the citizens, and one of the European citizens. Now, my point here is that, well, a lot of things have been said already on the relationship between metonymy and gesture, but the common thought on metonymy and gesture is that the deictic gesture always indicates a perceptually conspicuous site as a reference point, so the source of the for identifying the target. So along with the idea that, like with the 5 sails, also the gesture points at the source, at the conspicuous site serving as reference point for identifying the target. But in this case, the target, namely Europe, is already very clear and doesn't need to be reached at all. So the gesture isn't serving as a reference point. The gesture is serving as some sort of specifying. We have already mental access to the target. We are talking about Europe, that's okay. So no need to come up with a reference point. So the gesture is sort of serving another function, let's say, and this is something which hasn't been observed yet to a great extent in literature on metonymy and pointing gesture. So the target concept is already prominently profiled, and the self-pointing sort of identifies the self as a citizen of Europe. So there is no motivation here to describe this metonymy in terms of target to source, but rather the other way around. Not to describe it in terms of source to target, but rather the other way around. We already have access to the target, and then the gesture adds some sort of specification. There is a contiguity relation, okay? So there is a relation between part whole or citizen or of an institute or I don't know, or a country. So we're not dealing with some sort of reference point, I should say, but rather some sort of situational ground, the process of situational grounding, which is unfolding here, leading from the target to the source. And this is where German has like Shakespeare's language, but Kant's language has the upper hand here in the term Veranschaulichungsverfahren. Yeah. It really says it all. We have access to a concept, but the Veranschaulichung is a specification. We sort of depict by gesturing, make it clear what is meant, Europe and me being a citizen. So I think there's some sort of multimodal blend going on here between the source and the target, both being profiled verbally and with the target, like we saw with the suffocating. So I think by looking at examples like these, and I'm not into statistics at this point, I didn't do the counting, I'm just observing phenomena just to make sure and to make clear that for different phenomena, these pointing gestures do play a significant role. But I think we need to adjust on basis of examples like these to adjust our traditional cognitive account of cognitive metonymy by taking situational resources like the usage event we just saw into account. Okay, and this hooks up with what Ladewig says in 2008 when he says pointing gestures are some sort of grammatical grounding elements. And grounding elements, they serve the specific function of relating a profiled thing, Europe in this case, or a process to the ground, the communicative ground, speaker, hearer, the situation in which an utterance is being made. That's the so-called communicative ground, without referring to the ground explicitly. And okay, that's debate. So we could speak about grounding metonymy as some sort of variant, a related construction. Question here, does the pointing gesture really profile the envisaged referent? Is she also explicitly state she's pointing at herself? It's not the same directness or explicitness as if she would say, as I am a member of Europe, She isn't doing so. She's pointing at her. So it's more of an indirect profiling of herself as a as a matter of fact, really grounding the concept here of Europe. This is what Lanaker means by they do not themselves refer to the ground explicitly, a grounding element. And I think the pointing gesture in this case serves truly as a grounding element. Okay, let's move to argument structure. We talked about parentheses, about metonymy. Argument structure, it's a big thing in linguistics. You can approach argument structure from a syntactic point of view, from a conceptual point of view. It's all about verbs organizing our utterances in roles, thematic roles, objects, valence structure, if you'd like, where we can identify things like an intransitive subject, where you have an intransitive verb, like sleep, where there's no object, I sleep. I can have a transitive verb, I write a book. I write opens up the slot for an object. The book, that's a transitive an object, but I can identify a second object. So this is the so-called ditransitive object. This is argument structure, right? So let's have a look at another following example at this politician, where at a certain point she says, in that special committee, we have definitely thought about that because I think that that's a shared concern. It's a bit difficult. I'm just giving you a snippet here. I told you we're not talking about content. I'm interested in it's a shared concern, which is an adjective. Okay, and she uses self-pointing, and also pointing at the other at her colleague.
In het bijzonder comité, daar hebben we wel degelijk aan gedacht.
Image freezes. I'm going to play one more. I'm going to play one more time.
I think usually this
aan gedacht, want ik denk dat daar een gedeelde bekommernis is.
Okay, 1/3 attempt. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
In het bijzonder comité, daar hebben we wel degelijk aan gedacht, want ik denk dat dat een gedeelde bekommernis is.
Yes, image freezes. At a certain point, she says, I think it's a shared concern. A shared concern. If you just stick to the protocols, you miss this completely. You just read, it's a shared concern, but you do not know it's a shared concern by you or by other people, that she's involved. You might guess she is, but you do not know. If you look at the gestures, you know that she's involved. She's talking to a colleague and she has the back and forth, the pointing gesture between them. Okay. So the pointing act is an identification of the interactants as a reference and is some sort of interaction management. But of course, what happens here is shared is the past participle operating as an adjective to shared concern, a shared concern. But what the pointing gesture is adding is the argument structure of the underlying verb to share something between, well, I share something with you. And you only have this argument structure related to the verb, which underlies the past participle here, right? So what you see here is that the pointing gesture really is sort of adding elements from the verbal structure into a noun phrase, okay? So the verbal utterance shared profiles an atemporal relationship or an atemporal relation in Lanaker's term. Whereas the dual pointing gesture indicates reference of the structure of the underlying verb, which Lanaker calls, and that's the technical term, a complex atemporal relation. That's not of interest here. If you want to go and look at Lanaker makes a difference between, on the left-hand side, the profiling of a process with a verb, where he says a verb designates a continuous series of states distributed through time. That's what, in schematic terms, a verb profiles. To break through time a relationship between someone doing something and an object. Okay. On the right-hand side, that's of our interest here, an atemporal relationship or an atemporal relation is a stative construal, which designates only the final state in the overall process, with the process, as we saw in B, in the background. So you only sort of highlight the final state. So if this politician says, it's a shared concern. She's verbally only profiling the final element, the final state. But what she is doing gesturally is bringing in elements from the verb where you profile the process. I'm going to skip this example. Okay. Yeah, well, in technical terms, you may wonder, is this a construction? Yes or no? I should say, yes, it's a construction. This is a technical linguistic matter here. I'm going to skip this part, and because I only have a few minutes left, and I still want to come to my last example, which also has to do with the construction, which is the example we saw before with this politician. You remember at the end of the Q&A saying, well, much has been said here. A lot of questions have been asked, and I've also understood that I get a lot of homework with me. So 3 times he uses the same self-pointing gesture using both his hands, which is some sort of copying behavior or multimodal alignment, if you'd like. I'm going to play them very briefly, if this is...
Er is veel gezegd. Veel vragen gesteld.
Okay, you'll have to believe me that 3 times he uses the same gesture.
Huiswerk meekrijgt.
Okay, so what's going on here? If you look at the utterances, before I move on, I will be talking about the so-called ditransitive. The ditransitive in linguistics, very briefly here, is the verb being combined with 2 objects, a direct object and an indirect object, like she gave her father a book. A book, the direct object, her father, the indirect object. In two variants, it can be realized as the dative variant or as the prepositional variant. She gave a book to her father. Okay, that's the ditransitive. Now, if you look at what is being said here, sorry, yes, that's the slide on, because much has been said here. Hier is veel gezegd. A lot of questions have been asked. I do not have elements for the ditransitive. What it says here, it's a passive really of much has been said. To whom? I do not know. By whom? I do not know. Verbally, it is not being expressed. A lot of questions have been asked. To whom? I do not know. By whom? I do not know. So verbally, you do not have evidence to state that we're dealing with a ditransitive. It's only by looking at the gesture that you get evidence that it is really a ditransitive which is at stake here. Because twice, the first 2 tokens, you have a syntactically embedded pointing which is going on. Pointing indicating the indirect object, or in semantic terms, the recipient. A lot has been said here, a lot of questions have been asked to me. And it's not just the recipient which is being explicated or being made explicit here. It's also the agent by you. He isn't using the gesture like a lot of things have been said here. A lot of questions have been asked to me. He could have done like this, and then he would only have profiled the recipient. Now he goes like him sitting in this hall, right? A lot of things have been said, so he has this gesture with a big amplitude going like, by all of you, or quite a lot of you, to me. So he realizes on the gestural level, 2 arguments or 2 semantic roles, if you'd like, the indirect object or the recipient and the agent, the agentive adjunct, okay? Which can only be identified if you take the multimodal perspective. And then you have to conclude that this really is a multimodal realization of a ditransitive construction. Okay, it's vague with regard to, is it the dative variant or is it the prepositional variant? My hypothesis is, by the amplitude, that it's to me and not the dative variant. But that's another experiment I'm going to run. Okay, that's of secondary importance. If you take the 3 tokens, also the last one where he says, I understand that I get a lot of homework with me, there is no syntactic construction there which sort of integrates or embeds the gesture as an argument. But on a semantic level, again, it's the recipient, of course, and the agent being profiled just as well. Okay, so what we see here is pointing as a situationally mediated interactional resource. Of course, we have to take into account the affordances of the big plenary hall, and it's not the intimate setting of a studio. So the materiality is also a semantic resource which has to be taken into account, and it's gestured with big amplitude. Of course, the frontal orientation, the centripetal movement plays a role in terms of location, materiality, using both hands and not just one single hand. So what we see here is an integration of verbal structure, but also processual structure and material elements in terms of argument structure, spatial deixis, stance taking. It adds to the intensity, right? To repeat the same gesture 3 times. So yes, I'm going to speed up a bit. The title of my talk was Subjective and Objective Construal. The thing here is, as we saw with the shared concern, remember, you're not naming the people who have asked the question. And in the last example, he isn't saying a lot of things have been said to me. So he's not explicitly stating the recipient. He's not explicitly stating the agent, but everybody knows who is meant. And this is the subtle difference between subjectification, where everybody knows who is meant, but it's still implicit on the one hand, and on the other hand, if you objectify something, you explicitly state linguistically which elements of the ground are being used. This is taken from Lanneker's schematic representation of communication, where you have elements from the ground which may gain prominence to such an extent that you name them explicitly, the red arrow. A lot of questions have been asked by you to me. That would be an example of objectification on the one hand, and on the other hand, the green arrow, taking elements of the ground, where you have the interaction between speaker and hearer and all the circumstances that come with it, where you sort of give bigger prominence to elements from the ground, but without naming them. But giving bigger prominence so that everybody knows who is meant. In this case, like a lot of questions have been asked, a lot of things have been said, but you need the gestures to complete the picture of the subjectification. So you see my question, is the gesture really not making explicit who is meant, who has asked the question, and who has heard the question, yes or no? I do not know. What I do know is that you do need the multimodal approach in order to get to an accurate analysis of this interaction. Okay, I'm going to skip to my conclusion. So I've been looking at systematic co-occurrence of speech and gesture here, and focusing on pointing gesture as a powerful mechanism of grammatical and conceptual construal. And mind you, with grammatical construal, we are at the heart of linguistic organization. Remember at the beginning where we said, yeah, well, high interest rates or low interest rates and prices rise. You could say, yeah, well, that's secondary. We could do without. That's conceptual addition, aesthetics. In this case, it's not aesthetics. It's about the syntactic construction, syntactic structure, which is the core of linguistic organization. So pointing gestures put situated, embodied interaction at the heart of the process of meaning coordination, right? Not as some sort of aesthetic, superfluous element which can be, which is of secondary importance. Pointing gestures really embody the inevitable integration of conceptual and grammatical structure, but also local, material, spatial, interactional resources, as we just have seen in these examples. So integration of gestures and locally situated aspects of interaction in grammatical construction feeds into debates, ongoing debates about what about multimodal analysis of constructions? Can we identify things like multimodal constructions? I should say yes, if we continue looking at the importance of pointing gesture, for instance. What is the relative prominence of formal information within a construction? is the gestural information, does it have the same prominence as the verbal information, which is more explicit? And what about the impact of different construals like salience, vagueness, profiling, subjectification, which are at play clearly at the semantic pole of any construction? And I'm closing off by two quotes by Silva Ladewig in her 2020 book. She says that gestures are linked to the syntactic structure of spoken utterances has been mentioned many times in the literature. However, arguing that gestures can be integrated into the syntax of speech and thus expanding the scope of verbal grammars to include gesture pushes the envelope further. And then she continues, although a fair amount of research discussing a grammar-gesture link has been presented, this research strand is still in its infancy. And it's to that observation that I wanted to add a very brief observation by just focusing on just a few phenomena, including pointing gestures. Thank you.
Thank you.